Hello, everyone, and welcome to Introduction to Psychology. Today, of course, we will cover Chapter 1 and hopefully prepare you for the quiz that is due on Sunday at 9 p.m. But anyway, with that said, let me go ahead and share my screen with you and we can go over that material. Okay, if you haven't already connected with me, either respond to the email that gives me your preferred email address and also your cell phone number. Please do so now, because if I don't have you programmed into my cell phone, if you do want to contact me, it's probably not going to get through. Also, the quickest way to get responses from me is using WhatsApp. So just take the screen and take a snapshot with your phone and please connect with me there. And usually I can respond with WhatsApp as long as I'm not in a meeting or recording a video. I respond within minutes. So please do so now. So let's get right into the material. If you haven't already seen the videos that are available that I created as an introduction to each chapter, I highly recommend you do it. Matter of fact, it's part of the course material and a requirement for you to watch all the videos. Make sure you go through D2L to watch the video, and I'll go ahead and turn on one for you now.
Welcome to Psychology 2301, General Psychology with Professor Jeffrey Hastings. Have you ever pondered the origins of your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors? Welcome to the fascinating world of psychological science, a field that seeks to unravel these mysteries of the mind. In this summary video, we embark on a journey through Chapter 1 of Introduction to Psychology, Gateways to Mind and Behavior, by Dennis Kuhn, John Mitterer, and Tanya Martini, 16th edition, published by Cengage Publishing. In Chapter 1, The Foundations of Psychological Science, our journey begins with a trip through time exploring the history of psychological science. The field's roots trace back to ancient civilizations. Philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle pondered the human mind and laid the groundwork for future exploration. Fast forward to the 19th century, when Wilhelm Wundt established the first psychology laboratory, marking the official birth of psychology as a separate and distinct field. Next, we venture into the contemporary realm of psychological science and the biopsychosocial model. This model emphasizes the intricate interplay between biological, psychological, and social factors in shaping our behavior. It serves as a reminder that human behavior cannot be reduced to a single cause, but rather is a complex tapestry woven from multiple threads. We then shift our focus to the core features of psychological science. Critical thinking, skepticism, objectivity, and the reliance on empirical methods are the pillars that uphold the integrity of psychological science. These core features ensure that psychological research remains rigorous, reliable, and relevant. Moving on, we examine the role of experimental research, where cause meets effect. Experimental research allows psychologists to establish causal relationships, providing valuable insights into the hows and whys of human behavior. The manipulation of variables and the control of extraneous factors are vital components of this research method. Finally, we delve into non-experimental research. Here, we lose a bit of control. In non-experimental research, variables are not manipulated. Instead, they are observed as they naturally occur. While this method may not provide definitive cause and effect relationships, it offers valuable insights into real-world phenomena that cannot be experimentally manipulated. In summary, psychological science is a dynamic and multifaceted field. It is rooted in a rich history and continues to evolve, guided by the biopsychosocial model. Its core features ensure the integrity of research, and experimental and non-experimental methods provide diverse approaches to understanding human behavior. Remember, every thought, every emotion, every action is a piece of the puzzle that is the human mind. Psychological science seeks to put these pieces together to understand the whole picture of who we are and why we behave the way we do. In our next video, we're diving headfirst into the mesmerizing world of the nervous system. Get ready to unlock the secrets of the brain, unravel the mysteries of nerve impulses, and discover the awe-inspiring power of our body's control center. If you are a student, make sure to subscribe to the channel to keep up with the latest videos and content. Until then, keep that curiosity sparked and your excitement ignited. Thank you for watching.
So to help you prepare for each one of the quizzes that we have during the week, it's important that you watch the videos, but also it's important that you read the chapter in the book. And because this is the first class, there's a possibility, I realize, that you may not have your book yet. And because of that, I have gone ahead in OneNote and I've added the entire contents of chapter one within that OneNote tab. So if you're having a problem with that or downloading OneNote and copying it, the file to your own file, please let me know. Send me an email, send me a message, and I'll help you get that done. But as you will see in OneNote, the very bottom tab actually has how to use OneNote. So you may be able to figure it out for yourself there. So before we get into our lesson, let me just ask you a few questions to think about. When you think of the word psychology, what comes to mind? Do you think about just a psychologist with someone on the couch? I mean, psychology is a lot more than that you're going to find out here very, very soon. And also, what do you hope to learn from this course? I know it's a requirement in your program and to complete psychology, the intro to psychology, but I hope you'll find that this course gives you great information that can really change the course of your life. It doesn't matter whether you want to become a psychologist, you want to work as a manager, a leader, you want to own your own business or get into sales. Psychology is a very, very important aspect of the process and also for your success. So I highly encourage you to really listen to the lesson plans, read the work, do the work, ask questions, get involved, take notes, and pay attention to some of the things that we're going to talk about. Because not only can you get an A in this class by doing that, it can truly change the course of your life. So I highly encourage you do that. So, and then how may this course help you in your career? So think about that. Whatever career that you hope to enter or you're in now, think about how psychology can really impact that career. And how may this course also help you in your life? So you can think about what the way the human brain and behavior works. How is it affecting your personal relationships? That really is something to take a deep dive into and find out. If you're not happy with your career, you're not happy with the personal relationships, maybe you can really take an outside look at your own decision-making process and find ways to improve the way that you've made those decisions and, of course, change the outcome of your life. So let's get into Unit 1. It's called Common Sense Psychology, not necessarily common or sense, and talk about how psychology is a science. It's a science because it employs systematic methods and observations, experimentation, data analysis to understand and predict behavior and mental processes, and it's grounded in empirical evidence. So evidence that is proven that we use as, but it is a science and it's constantly, things change. And, the biggest debate between a lot of people in the research field is when we talk about behavior and personality, there are two different things that people look at and the two different arguments. Are these affected by how we're born, by these innate characteristics that we're born with, or is it more affected, our decision makings, our personality traits, or are they affected more by the environment? So, as we go along, we talk about the history of psychology, then you start to draw that conclusion for yourself. Is it more affected? Is who you are today affected more by your environment or more to do with how the traits and characteristics that you inherited from your parents? So also the psychology, important that it is defined as a scientific study of mind and behavior. The word of psychology comes from the Greek word psyche, meaning life, or logos, meaning explanation, the explanation of life. Mental processes, just a quick note about mental processes. We're going to talk about brain science, neurology quite a bit in later chapters, but that mental process, realize that they're strongly influenced by a combination. So it's a combination of biological, psychological, and other social factors in our environment. And that really comes to play with our mental process and the way we process information. So when we talk about common sense psychology beliefs, a lot of the beliefs that you may have heard of are false. There's something called uncritical acceptance. That's a tendency to believe that a claim is true because it seems true or because actually we wish it were true. Like horoscopes. If you read a horoscope and you take a look at it today, because you're looking at it, if you believe in the horoscope, you're going to read it in a certain way and it's going to make sense to you. And it's going to probably, you're going to find one way to apply it in your life. And you realize how kind of ridiculous that is by reading other horoscopes and seeing if they also apply to you. And so, in other words, you're going to kind of believe things that you see or you want to believe. That happens. Our brain or mind plays tricks on us all the time. And that's called uncritical acceptance. We're not critically thinking, we're just accepting it to be true because we hope or we think it's true. Also, another important definition is called confirmation bias. That's a tendency for us to remember information that fits our expectations while ignoring discrepancy. We're ignoring the red flags or the discrepancies, the things um, that should be telling us that that thing is not true. But because we already have this one belief in something, we tend to see things. And we'll talk about self-fulfilling prophecy, but also how when your outlook on life is a certain way, if you think everything in your life is bad, well, you kind of look for things to be bad. And that ends up your expectations are seeing the bad things in people, in the environment, in your job, in school. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, meaning when you see it as bad, it starts to become bad. That becomes your own reality. And that's also true for when you see things, the positive in life. If you see all the blessings and the gifts that you have and you appreciate those things, that you see the world as a good place. You see people as relatively and inherently good. So that also realize that confirmation bias, you may not even realize it. That's what's called unconscious confirmation or beliefs. And also, it also involves active avoidance and disregard of that which contradicts our own expectations. So when you're having a conversation with someone and you think about it, they may have a different point of view, let's say just on the presidential race. If you already love or hate a contender in the presidential race, then it doesn't matter what someone says, you're probably going to continue to believe the way that you believe. So that's called confirmation bias. So superstition is just a belief lacking in objective evidence. These definitions are important. They may be on your test, so something to kind of write down. Pseudoscience, it's false science like astrology, phrenology, and graphology. So that phrenology, that's actually the shape and size of someone's head. A lot of people said the bigger your head, the smarter you are. There's actually some research that kind of shows that a little bit, but it really is not true. Graphology is handwriting. How you handwrite is a lot of people study that, say it's an expression of personality, and people believe that that can reveal traits. So that's just something to kind of take in mind. Those are what superstition and pseudoscience actually is. It's not real. It's not scientifically backed or proven to be true. It's just what people believe. So we're not going to go over these discussion too much, but I do want to ask if these aren't true, why are they so popular? A lot of people read horoscopes, for instance, for entertainment basis for the most part. Some people unfortunately do believe in a lot of that. As long as their belief is a positive one and they see the positive in what they believe, then I guess it can't hurt them, but it's not scientifically backed. So, but they're really popular because people want to find answers to questions that they don't have the answer to. And sometimes these sciences, these fake sciences, give them that answer, and that's why people believe it. So about psychologists, I won't go over this too much, but just on what the field of psychology and what psychologists do. And first off, you have to be qualified, a minimum of a master or even a PhD. It has several years of postgraduate training, but I can tell you that it is an amazing field. I'm an IO psychology master's degree person, and I've studied it for many years, and I've done research for over 25 years. And it's something that I really enjoy doing, conducting research to try to solve complex problems. The way that my focus is in applied psychology is with business. So the study of finding out why people react the way they do, what is the best way to assign team members based on personality traits, characteristics, preferences, what people are going to work best on a team. Those are the kind of things that I like to research and study and help business owners become profitable, but also have happy, engaged, and motivated employees. So also psychologists they teach like I do, and also research. And of course, you all are already know that consulting and therapy, counseling is a big part of psychology. But there's also research in a non-academic setting. That's what I've done primarily, even though I have done academic research as well. Most of my research has been applied research, meaning a company would hire me, then I would do research and then give them a report or on my findings. So it's specifically for a company and a specific problem. So, what do they study? What do psychologists study? Of course, cognitive, emotional, and social processes and behavior by either observing, so it's just looking at what's going on in an environment. So that's through observation, but also, interpreting that data, recording how individuals relate to one another and to their environments. But then you can also manipulate the environment and do a scientific study where you will apply a certain method and manipulate it and see what would happen. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But that also, to study human behavior, it's very systematic and it has to be methodical. When you're conducting scientific research, you have to really take into account all the different factors and variables that can be affecting the outcome of your research. And we'll talk more about that here in a moment. Whenever you see that logo, by the way, Lone Star College kind of spinning, that's an indication that that page there definitely is a test question on that. It doesn't mean if it doesn't circle, there's not a test question. However, when it does move like that, it's just specific to that page. So another thing, there are different types of research. There's basic research. Of course, I mentioned applied research, and then there's an animal model that happens quite a bit. And I just want to talk about a few things real quickly, important notes to understand that basic research is you're seeking knowledge for the sake of knowledge. That's really, I think, called basic. I call it's academic. A lot of people that are in academia that are professors or researchers for institutes are required to publish so many articles or research, and or people just want to publish research for ego to get their name on a research paper. And so that's just the seeking knowledge for the sake of knowledge. For example, they want to find out, and I put on here how memory works, or for academia to be published, but applied is working within a company. And of course, a small percentage of experiments may use an animal model where they're not actually using people within those experiments. So here are different types of professionals. You can read about that later, but there are, of course, as you will see, there are a lot of different types of mental health professionals that have psychology, masters, PhDs, and of course, most of these in most states require a PhD, not just a master degree, and a lot of study and a lot of experience. So on the test, a couple of different things. You may have to match different types in one way or another. Maybe one question, maybe a bonus question could have maybe 4 or 5 on there. But the research areas, just understanding what is developmental research, learning, personality, sensation, perception, social psychology, and kind of matching that with this research area. And, I'm not going to go through all of this, but I do want to make sure that you cover this whenever you're studying. So developmental is like child psychology, working with children, seeing how they progress and they develop from, young children to as they age. Learning is, of course, conditioning and memory. So that's important to understand with, when you're studying memory and how people learn. We'll talk more about that later. Personality, looking at individual differences and motivation, what motivates people to do what they do. And sensation perception is processing sensory information. Of course, social psychology is the attitude, groups, and leadership within groups. So let's look at a history of psychology. An introduction to psychology, how experiments, we want to understand how some of the most important experiments have really impacted psychology today. So there are contemporary psychologists that have built on the findings of these studies to better understand human behaviors, contemporary meaning newer. So, and that's what happens with research. We're constantly building on previous research. That's why it's so important that published research articles are accurate, because, and this is really coming to play even over the last year or so, that, or 2 years, that there are a lot of experiments out there with AI. There's a lot of ways to check and validate to see if the experiments that have been done are valid and reliable. And valid means that they are measuring what they're intending to measure, and reliable meaning if someone follows these step-by-step instructions in setting up an experiment, that they're going to have similar results. And what we're finding is there are quite a few studies that have been very, very popular that the data may have been manipulated in some way or another. So when that happens, then of course future research that's built on that prior research may not be accurate. So it's very, very important that they're controlled within these research studies. So here's a few notable psychologists and some experiments that they've created. Wilhelm Wundt, you'll hear about him in a moment, but he's considered the father of psychology. We'll talk about John Watson and the Little Albert experiment, B.F. Skinner, Stanley Milgram, Martin Seligman, and Walter Mitchell. So William Wundt, he is just known as the father of psychology because he actually created the first scientific lab, and he relied on scientific observation. So without manipulation, observing different things that happen and drawing a conclusion based on those observations. So he really sought to train introspectionists to be systematic and scientific. So whenever they're observing people's behavior, that they're very methodical about that, that they take a standardized approach, and because when you're testing or looking at trying to find the similarities and differences between human behavior and all the different, there's so many different variables, you've got to be very careful to make sure that that is very systematic. So we'll talk about the scientific method is one way that's universally accepted, how experiments are actually done. But he studied vision, hearing, taste, touch, memory, time perception, and a lot of other topics. So then we're going to talk about, he measured stimuli. You'll hear about that. What stimulus is physical energy that affects a person and evokes a response. We'll talk about stimulus and conditional response when we get into Pavlov's dog, you may have heard about, but also introspection. That's when someone, personal observations of different type of events, the mental events, thoughts, feelings, and behavior. And a lot of the studies that are done are actually reliant upon self-report, meaning that the questionnaire is given to that person and they're reporting on what they believe to be about themselves. And that comes with a lot of problems. A self-report questionnaire, number one, you're relying on them being honest. You're relying on them understanding themselves, understanding their own behavior. So having really good self-awareness, and not all people do have great self-awareness. They may think that they don't offend people, and they do. They may think they're great socially, and they're not. So that's a real big problem with self-awareness. And then the final thing, problem with doing these self-report research studies is that sometimes when they're reporting, if they think that there could be any repercussion, or they think that they don't want people to know how they really are in their private life, they may not answer correctly or honestly. So that's also something to consider when you're conducting a research experiment. And so one thing to know about structuralism, that's the study of sensation and personal experience as a basic element. So structuralism, that's a form of psychological research. So there's introspection, structuralism. Just make sure that you understand that definition. The shortcomings of introspection, kind of talked about that just a minute ago. It fails to produce always reliable observations of the mind. It's not always failing to produce that, but it's very common. And there's also serial positioning that confirms much thinking takes place in the cognitive unconscious, and that's not always true. So sometimes there's not a lot of things that are actually going on. People do what they kind of do, and a lot of time it is very unconscious as well, and the different factors that we'll talk about later. Gestalt psychology, there was Max Wertmeyer. Probably don't need to know that, but this is an open book test, so you do have these slides. Just to let you know too, on these slides, not every single thing that you're going to see today is on your copy of the slides. I've added some things, so you want to make sure that you're taking notes. I should have told you that at the beginning. I don't think I've added too many things at the beginning, but you'll start to see some things that may not be the same. If you have your slides open, Make sure you're taking notes. When you see something that's been added, I can tell you it's probably meaning that I added it because it's a question on the test, or it could be a question on the test. So make sure that you take notes. But understand what Gestalt psychology actually did, and with Max Wertheimer, it's a studied experiences of thinking, learning, personality, and perception as a whole units, not by parts. So it really looked at it as a structuralist, looking at everything as they all are interconnected. So that was the theory at that time. They're all connected. And then, according to Gestalt psychologists, perceptions have a powerful tendency to form meaningful patterns. And to this day, I mean, a lot of people do believe in a lot of that, and they do have patterns. But there's, some different theories that we'll talk about as well, like in coming up functionalism, for instance. William James then came out. He considered behavior in terms of active adaptation. So that's basically meaning that your consciousness is always changing. And it really talks about, there's a couple of different things you'll see here. First off, very Darwinian, thinking about how people are changing. So if you think about Darwin's theory of evolution, that he said that the environment, we change through time. So that in natural selection, meaning that the strongest will survive, that the weakest will get eaten or killed by the stronger species, so that stronger species always survives. And that's kind of Darwinian theory. And that's also part of functionalism, is talking about that things do change, but the stronger your characteristics, your traits, those are the things that are going to survive in psychology. When we're talking about through psychology, is really what functionalism is. And William James was associated with that. And of course, really started a lot of that, or is credited for that. You may have heard also about Sigmund Freud. There are a lot of his theories that have been really thought of today as kind of comical in some ways, but there are still some great things that he brought to psychology and is known for. And one of the best things that he brought to everyone is psychoanalytic psychology, where he really talked about this, our consciousness, our subconscious, unconscious, and then of course he talked also about, he brought in later, years later, something called dynamic unconscious. And that's the area of the mind outside of personal awareness. We have no awareness of it, but we react. And you think about, what kind of things could that be? What is really so deep that we either buried or we may not have even experienced that affect our behavior today? And I mean, you think about, an example, let's just think about roaches. Why are we so scared of roaches? I hate roaches. I see one, I'd like to move. But roaches, you think about, they don't, they can survive anything, and they don't bite, they don't sting. They did carry diseases many, many years ago, or they are thought to have done that. And, that may have been because of ancestors and because of this, fear from when we were young and our parents. It's something we carry on. So there is a lot of, it's really not, and you think about it, are we born with a fear of roaches? Probably not. It's more of that environment. When you see your parents scared of something, or you see other people scared, it just, oh, I must be scared of this. And we'll talk about more of that a little bit later. But we really don't know why. But it may be things that have happened many, many, many thousand years ago that could be buried in our consciousness. But what Freud really got into is really looking at this sex and aggression as really controlling a lot of our behaviors, and sex being not just the act of sex, but the survival instinct of reproduction as well. And he talks about these unconscious thoughts and the id, the ego, the superego, that we have different parts of our mind and we act in a certain way. And we won't get into it too much because there's not a question on the test, I don't believe, about the id, ego, superego, but it's a very, really fascinating theory that he did create. So here are just the questions, just kind of look at this, see if you know the answers. Not going to go into it because I want to finish up this within a few hours like a normal class. But there's also behavioralism. And we talk about John Watson, and the little Albert experiment was one of his most famous research projects. He did quite a few, but he was he studied the mind or conscious experience. He really launched a school of thought that's, of course, referred to as behavioralism. And he thought that introspection, that everyone believed within introspection, he thought it was unscientific because there's no real objective way to study behavior. And because of that, and because of the people that all the observers that are studying behavior, he thought that there's a basic problem with that introspection and understanding how can someone really measure introspection when you don't have a standardized way to do that. So behavioralism and learning theory, first off, the definition of learning theory, it's different than psychoanalytic theory that Freud talked about, but he says learning theory emphasizes the experience of behaviors being rewarded or punished. So our behavior is this the thing that we do? Are we going to receive a reward or are we going to be punished? And a lot of that really comes into play too when you look at the really foundation of it is fight or flight. And of course, freeze, fight or flight. You probably have heard of that. And we'll talk a lot about that as we progress in this class. But that's really the foundation of human behavior. And it is our innate ability or desire to not be hurt. So I want you to think about this for a moment, but with fight or flight and all of behavior, all of the decisions we make are these things that are reactions to events. Excuse me. We look at it, if you look at behavioralism, reward, with that reward system, or is it something that we're going to have pain or reward? That's really, if you heard of pain or pleasure principle, there are two ends of this spectrum that are motivating us. And we have, when you think first of pleasure, I want you to think about someone that you're very attracted to. That's the easiest way to think about this principle. And you think about if that person walked into the room right now, you would be motivated to talk to that person because you're attracted to them. You like them. You'd like to get to know them better. So that is a motivation. However, you look at what is stronger. Is it that pleasure or is pain a stronger motivator? And that pain can be death. It could be harm. It could be this fight or flight. So, and you think of which one is more motivating, what is really affecting your decision making, your behavior. I want you to think that that person's over there that you really like, but on the other side of the room, a lion just came in the room, and of course, you're shocked. Your first thing you're going to do is freeze, and within a moment's thought, your mind is thinking, "What should I do?" And I can tell you the motivation at that point is not going to be the person you're attracted to. It's going to be, how do I get away from this tiger, this lion? And when you realize that, you're either going to run from it, so it's flight, or you're going to fight it because you can't run from it. But real quickly, what you're probably going to realize to do is, hey, that person I'm real attracted to, I don't have to run faster than that lion, just the person I'm attracted to, and it's going to eat that person. It's kind of a joke, but seriously, when it's life or death situation, those trigger those milliseconds, you're making this decision, and there's a chemical reaction that goes on in your brain, and we'll talk about epinephrine, and which creates adrenaline that makes you fast, stronger, and allows you to free from safety. And it's the fight or flight thing. It's not just pain from being killed. That's part of it. But that fight or flight response that's automatic in your body, also you're going to learn that it is the biggest reason why you may be missing opportunities today, or you're selecting the wrong person in a relationship, or whatever. It's because, let's say you have a relationship, it's bad, and then so you're hurt, and you hear about defense mechanisms. You kind of put up a wall, and then you meet another person. It happens again. So every single time this event happens, you're going to be less likely to do it again because we don't want to be hurt. It's a protective mechanism to prevent us from being hurt. But what happens if the perfect person walks into your life and you have all of this baggage from these failed relationships? You may not see how beautiful and amazing that other person is. That's where these defense mechanisms, this fight or flight response, can prevent you also from accomplishing great things. So that's really what it comes down to with this behavioralism and some of these theories we're going to talk about, is that you being very self-aware of why you make decisions, why do you do the things you do, and understanding that is the only way that you're going to be able to live a better life. That's the only way you'll be able to start making better decisions. Very, very important thing to learn there. And so you're going to take really a deep dive into it to take a look at it. And if you're happy with your life, at home, your relationships, you're happy with maybe a career or a job one day or your current job, and everything's going in the right path, then it's not a big concern. But if there's something that is in disagreement with what your reality is not what you want it to be, then that's when you need to take a deep dive and think about, why am I making these decisions over and over again? So we'll talk more about that later. But let me tell you about Watson's experiment. I think I've got a slide on that. But here it is. This is a little Albert experiment, and back in 100 years ago, or less, even 50 years ago, there were some pretty crazy experiments that were done that wouldn't be accepted today. And this is definitely one of them. But it really, this experiment taught us a lot about fear. And what they did, with Watson and Rayner, they had a baby and they put on a scary mask, like a clown. It was a white clown mask, I believe. And they looked at the baby, and the baby just kind of looked at them, didn't do anything. And then what they did is they put on the mask and slammed on the desk. And it, of course, scared the crud out of the baby, and the baby starts crying and screaming. They do it over and over. And here's what they learned. Soon, no longer did they have to slam on the desk or make a loud noise. They show the baby the mask, and the baby started crying because they associated the loud noise or the fear with the mask. So think about what this does to your brain. And this is what's called a conditioned emotional response. It's conditioned. It means it wasn't there before, but now something has happened several times. Now it's conditioned response. That's where it's an autopilot. That's the same thing with bad relationships. We have conditioned response with a bad relationship when we get hurt, to automatically fear that person that reminds you of the other person, to not like them. And and here's what they also found with that experiment years and years later. First off, the baby had severe psychological issues for many years. And also, it wasn't just a white mask. It related, they did this thing with a white rabbit, a bunny rabbit, where they scared the baby too. But what the baby started associating with anything white and fluffy or furry, the baby started crying. So that association is what they learned. It's not just, it can actually attach to other things, where it's not just the white clown mask, it was anything white and fluffy. So that's a very, very important psychological experiment. So, and that's, classical conditioning. And that is where you have, the stimulus generalization is exactly what I just mentioned. When it becomes that stimulus, that white mask becomes very generalized, anything white. And it becomes fluffy too, with the rabbit and the rat that went to the rat to rabbits, other type, anything furry, and even stuffed animals. Of course, the baby cried. And you've got different definitions. There's a neutral stimulus. I want you to, understand what that is. That is, a white rat. It doesn't initially, that neutral stimulus, meaning it's not conditioned. It was the mask didn't create an emotional response. But then there's that unconditioned stimulus, and that's the loud noise. It wasn't conditioned yet, but then in an unconditioned response, that's the fear. So there's not fear now, but then when it's conditioned, means that they relate the mask to the sound, which creates an emotional response. Now it's a conditioned response, conditioned stimulus. So just realize kind of what that is if you do have a question on the test, but it's also important for you just to know what that is in psychology. Radical behavioralism, this is B.F. Skinner, and he believed actions were controlled by rewards and punishments. And I'll talk about one of his. He was a professor at Harvard, and you see a little Lone Star kind of moving around there. It tells you what it is. And you've probably seen some of the operant conditioning, the reinforcement, punishment. This was the fear, the reinforcement, a treat or punishment. You probably heard of, Pavlov dog. We'll talk about here in a moment, but it's a technique that there's a consequence that follows a behavior. It's a reward that someone says you did a great job or whatever, or it's a punishment that you get in trouble for doing something, staying out late, doing something else, whatever it was. And, that's what that behavioralism, meaning that our reactions are an environment. And when we get a reward, or if we are punished for those things, the crazy thing is we want rewards, but we are actually motivated also when there's punishment involved. That's the thing that's the worst thing that can happen. You think about a child, isn't that just a parent isn't always rewarding and loving, and that's a great thing and it's motivating. But when a parent also always is recognizing, they always recognize the things you're doing wrong as a child, that's better than the worst thing is ignoring a child and not responding to a child is 10 times worse. And what you'll see with children that act out is that was the only way to get their parents attention. They're craving that attention is better than being ignored. And that's why that negative behavior is also repeated if that's the only way that child's going to get the attention of the parent. So this experiment here, very fascinating. Stanley Milgram it happened during he did this experiment when there was a Nazi after the World War II, a Nazi soldier that was being convicted. They're wondering how can someone like a soldier pay attention and do what Hitler told them to do by, in these concentration camps and these horrible things that happened. They're trying to think of and trying to determine what would have someone make them do the horrible things when they're just told to do it by a superior. And what they did is they put these people in a room. They first had, someone that was hooked up to machines, and then the other person in another room with a glass wall. And they said, what we want you to do is turn this knob, and we want you to shock the person. At first, they're going to be very light shocks, and it's going to become more and more intense. And actually, at the very end, it actually could be lethal. So they had them pushing these buttons, and when they do it, they see the reaction of the other person on the other side of the wall. There's this surprise and then the pain that happens. And what they didn't realize that was an actor on the other side of the wall. They really weren't being shocked, but they're acting like it's getting worse and worse and worse. And what they found was because of the authority of someone telling them, do it, most of the people paid attention to that command, and regardless of the pain it was causing, even though it created a lot of mental turmoil and strife, they did continue to press that button. Some of them actually crying when they're pressing that button, which actually proved that how powerful that authority figure could be. So another one that was a very powerful experiment that was done back in the early 60s. And then, and this just talks a little bit more about it. And there's a 2012 update, and it has a little bit difference in that, but we won't go over it too much. But just you need to know what that experiment was. I don't know if I ask any questions on the test, but still, just read that. It's in your slides. And of course, cognitive psychology, of course, that's to do with the human brain. That's the way that we think and how our brain affects our behavior. And the operational definition of it defines a scientific concept by stating specific actions or procedures used to measure it. And one of the most well-known cognitive psychologists, and it really attributes to humanistic psychology, is going to be Maslow. You may have heard of Abraham Maslow, but he has with his hierarchy of needs. If you heard of his hierarchy of needs, that what he believes is, first off, he believes in free will. Humanistic psychology said we as human beings are with our brain, we have free will to do what we want to do. And he believes that with that hierarchy of needs, that these basic needs need to be fulfilled before higher needs can be accomplished. So the first one and the first tier is more of your love, your self-esteem, the things that actually the water and all that, the things that you actually have to survive, then love, self-esteem, and it moves up. And the very top of that pyramid is called self-actualization. And that means that if you have all of the things that you need and you've progressed throughout your life in this pyramid structure, that you can become great and start to live for the benefit of other people. If you think of people like Mother Teresa or something like that, where their entire life is for the benefit of other people because they realize they have everything they need and they're there to help people. And the truth is, and a lot of people do believe today, I definitely believe it, that all of us can be there. And throughout our lives, we may go in and out of that. But the truth is, we all have, for the most part, what we need. But the biggest cause of stress in our life is the unfulfilled desires that we're always trying to get the things we need or we want. And it's that unfulfilled desire that causes stress and anxiety. And and that's really what ends up happening is that we tend to forget about the things that we have. So we tend to forget about all the blessings, the gifts, from shelter, food, water, love, support, and we no longer kind of see those as necessary and as valuable, and most for the most part. And when you don't see that as valuable, then and you don't appreciate the things you have, and you're constantly trying to get the next thing, the next promotion, a raise, buy the new car. That is really the kind of that reason for all of our stress and anxiety. So if you can find a way to really understand and be happy in the moment, to realize that you can't change the past. I mean, all the bad things that happen, that's a natural part of life. You can't change your past, but what you can do, and this is the whole goal of psychology, is to get someone to recognize that even these bad things, and they happen to everyone, see them from a different lens, start to appreciate what it has done. What did these negative situations, how were you able to overcome that? And how can you use it for the good? How can you take that negative situation and maybe help someone else overcome what you went through, what they're going through now? That's when you become kind of self-actualized, where you realize, hey, I'm happy. I can be happy with what I have today. If it's not wrong to want new things, but if you're consumed by it, that's when it causes the biggest amount of stress and anxiety. But Maslow talks a little bit about that. And here's another experiment I think that's one of the most important to understand, and it's called learned helplessness, and done in 1967, Martin Seligman. And what they did, and I think the best way to understand this is not just his experiment. I like there was an elephant. I think it's on my next slide. But what learned helplessness is, if you are constantly being told something, you're no good, you're not smart, you're not going to be what you would want to be, we start believing that. And that's a sad situation. Let me kind of show you. I think it's on, yeah, here's the next slide with an elephant. If you think about an elephant, and you wonder if you ever go to a circus and you see an elephant and they're just walking around, that's not a natural environment for an elephant that likes to run around and be obnoxious sometimes and play, believe it or not, the young elephants. And what they do to train an elephant is, when they first have them in captivity, they tie them up with a huge chain around the neck, very tight, very cruel too, and for the most part. But the elephant continues to try to escape, causing just huge pain and blister and bleeding from these chains for days and days and days, and then starts to realize that they can't get free of the chains. And when that happens, they take off the chain and they put a very tight rope, which creates this anxiety again. The elephant tries to escape, realize it can't, until later they actually can put a very, very weak rope around the elephant's neck, and they'll stop trying. That's what learned helplessness is. And that happens in life with us. It may not be so drastic, but the results are the same. When things happen like that in our own lives, we tend to believe them. And that truly is the thing. If you're listening now and you feel like, and we're going to go through intelligence a lot, and generalized intelligence in chapter 9, but we're going to talk about how SAT test, ACT test, there are 7 different types of intelligence, and that's just one type of generalized intelligence that's measured, because the other 6 can't truly be measured. That's if you didn't score the way that you think you should have scored on that test or any other one, it's not really a measurement of how smart you are. It's just a measurement of what you've learned growing up. Generalized intelligence is actually learned. And there are school districts that we'll talk more about later that are very privileged and have great teachers and great supplies, and they put a lot of emphasis on it, and they actually have better opportunities from an early age than some other school districts that aren't privileged. That's where the problem is. And that learned helplessness comes from areas when you grow up and you don't have that support or that belief that you're actually smart, because let's say you didn't score as high as you, but if you don't realize that that's only one part of it, doesn't measure, creativity and motivation, other things that we'll talk more about later. So that's one thing I hope you get out of this class, is to realize that, there are gifts that you will have. You just need to recognize those gifts and start to use the gifts. And finally, this is the last one I want to talk about, but this is seriously the most important experiment there is when it comes to happiness. It's called the marshmallow experiment in 1970. Walter Mischel performed it. And what he basically did is he put children in a room and put them in front of a marshmallow and said, we're going to give you one marshmallow right now. But we're going to leave. And when we come back, if you haven't eaten that marshmallow, I'm going to give you three marshmallows. And of course, you see the children, and I encourage you to go and watch the videos online. They're fascinating. But some of the kids that could just said, heck with that, I'm eating this marshmallow, I'm hungry, this looks good. And they couldn't control themselves and they ate it right away. And then there were kids that actually thought about, what is this reward going to be if I just wait? It's delayed gratification. And what, even though when they performed this experiment, they didn't realize what they were on to until years later, that when they looked at these children, that delayed gratification, and this is something learned, parents learn. If parents are always giving children exactly what they want when they want it because they don't want to hear the kid crying or screaming or whatever, that child is not learning to control emotions and delay gratification. So with the children that can delay gratification, their life, they were happier, they were physically better. The kids that could not delay gratification, I forgot the statistics. I don't want to throw it out there, but it was 2 or 3 times more likely to cheat on their spouses, to get a divorce, to drink, to um, overeat because he couldn't delay that gratification, realizing the benefits for that. So it's a very fascinating experiment. Whether you have children, you're going to have children one day. It's one that you really want to become familiar with because we have a short period of time with children to really affect this delayed gratification. If we don't take advantage of it, then that child can have problems throughout their entire life. So here's just another one. This is just matching the approach with the historical figure. So you kind of look at it and kind of match those people. And there's the answer to it with structuralism, humanistic, functionalism. It's just something that at least have handy whenever you're taking the test. And also realize that there's one thing I added in here, evolutionary psychologists. They believe genetically influenced behavior, that it's inherited and adaptive. That's what evolutionary means. So I mentioned it earlier, but it's something to kind of remember that specific definition. So they believe evolution, if you remember, something that they said, yes, you're born with certain things, but the environment also it's adaptive. And you do adapt. Remember, natural selection, the strongest will survive. That's part of evolutionary psychology. So we have that. And now let's get into 4. And this is a biopsychological framework, which emphasizes that each force of the biosocial framework, social framework, interacts with others to make up development. So when we look at it, we've got different forces. We have biological forces. That is what we're born with, our genes, health related factors that are biological. The psychological forces, and that's our perceptual, cognitive, emotional, personality factors that really, a lot of our psychological forces are something that we learn and definitely learn with sociocultural forces. That's how we're interacting with our culture, our environment, where we're born, what part of the world. Are we from a low income, high income area? So even from our voice, dialect, things like that, that are all sociocultural forces. And then we have life cycle. It just depends on what stage of our life. We're going to see things in a different way. We're actually going to maybe even like different types of music as you progress and as you age. And those are life cycle forces. Okay, so, and then you see how all these interact. Um, and you see that biology, social, psychological, this is the biopsychological or biosocial framework where all 3 of them are kind of interrelated. And biopsychology is a study of the brain, nervous system, and other physical origins of behavior. Important to kind of know that definition. And the biological forces, those are things that are just underlying process, part of our genetic code that make up who we are, how we're born. So you can see 2 out of 3 are really part of our environment. So physiological forces known by our behavior. So you have those, there are the 3 that we talk about and the different characteristics. And this just gives you a better definition of all of those. Now we'll talk about human diversity in the psychosocial model and understand what genetic bias in research. And this is just something to understand. There's a chapter on it. I think it's very, very important. But a lot of the research that has been done focused on only male people. Now, if you're Freud, it was all female that he kind of studied. But first off, the subjects could be female, but most of the researchers are men. So a different perspective back in the past. And a lot of these theories we built on. And it didn't account for a lot of the male female differences and how our environment is, how we react. And I can tell you one of the big things that they look at is, believe it or not, that when you look at male or boys as they're younger are more expressive and more energetic than even a female. But as they age, and it's mainly because of an environment where boys are told, not to show emotion, not to be that way, that they start to, where if you think about maybe boys and girls now genetically, that females are more expressive. They talk about their feelings more. But at the beginning, actually, boys talk more about that until they're told not to. So that's something that is part of our environment that actually tells us how we're supposed to behave and act. We'll talk more about that. I believe it's in chapter 7 and again in like 12. So the focus, and it says weird, the Western educated, industrial, rich, and democratic societies, that's where most of the research has been done. So the other ones that are, Eastern or uneducated, that aren't industrialized or poor, a lot of the research has not been done on them, or the foundations of our research, and that is a problem. In cultural relativity, when we get into research, it says behavior must be judged relative to values of the culture in which it occurs. There are some cultures, there's a certain behavior that's acceptable, in other cultures it's not. And that's another thing you have to take in consideration when we look at this research. So I'm not going to get into that. Let me go into the core features of psychological science. Important to know the goals of psychology, and that's to predict, describe, understand, and control behavior. That is the goal of psychology. So I mean, think about that a minute. To be able to predict behavior, to describe it, to understand it, and even control behavior. Think, what do you mean by control behavior? Well, if we're going to conduct a psychological experiment, we need to make sure that certain factors are controlled, that the environment is controlled, not the person is controlled, but the environment is controlled in a way that there aren't other factors or variables that are going to interact or play that we don't see that will make the result, that could be affecting the result of the study. So we want a controlled environment. So that's really what the goal of psychology. And of course, we've got to also think critically to meet psychology's goals, and to make sure that we have a need for logical analysis, empirical testing, that we're very structured in this approach and methodical. Falsification is an attempt to show how common sense belief or theory might be false. That's just a definition of what falsification means. And so let's get into the scientific method. I mentioned this earlier, that we have to have a methodical approach to research. And this, and you'll look at it, sometimes they say 6, sometimes 7-step method is widely accepted from cross cultures around the world as being, this is the step-by-step process whenever you're conducting an experiment to make sure that you're following these guidelines. So the scientific method is a process of experimentation. So an experiment, what does that mean? You think about it, it means that we're just not necessarily just observing, but a lot of times we're kind of affecting, we're kind of looking at the different outcomes. So we're seeing a cause and effect relationship between 2 or more variables. We'll talk about here in a moment. And a theory is an organized systems or assumptions and principles to explain a specific set of interrelationships, how things are related. So here are the steps, and starting with 1 up here, and we have them kind of put here. Observation, you make an observation, then your research topic or area, you're going to define that, set up your research project. You're going to make a hypothesis to say, this is what we think is true. We're going to test it with an experiment. We're going to kind of manipulate it a little bit, analyze the data, report conclusions. And then if it's not where we need it to be, we either stop or we change and look for those extenuating factors that may have affected our outcome. And just to make sure and validate our numbers to make sure that they're right. Real important to kind of understand a little bit of the step-by-step process. We're not going to get into specific research because we don't have time in the short class. How I wish we did, because it's a fun thing to do, and it's amazing to actually conduct a research experiment. I do through Ivy Consulting Group. We are conducting, I think there's 3 or 4 experiments, or really observations or self-report research projects going on right now that are very interesting. So, but systematic observation, this is human development researchers. They use one of 4 approaches to observe. There are self-reports. We talked about that. It could be where people report on their own behavior and mental processes. And we can also take psychological measures. We can measure heart rate and the sweating, other kind of things that we're looking at. And there's 2 forms of it. It's either naturalistic or structured. Naturalistic meaning we're not interfering with it, and then there's structured observation where we're controlling the environment. And just need to know a little bit about what that is, or the definition. So empirical approach, this just means it comes through, it states that the only source of our knowledge comes through our senses. That means it's sight, hearing, touch, and it's gaining knowledge through experience. It quickly became scientific approach and greatly influenced the development of physics and chemistry in the 17th and 18th centuries. And step 1, of course, in the scientific method is make an observation. Step 2 is ask the question. Not going to go over that, but what we're asking the question is, how does X is one variable, and we have 2 different variables. We will have a, how does X, and that is, we have our variable saying that we've got, and it's 1 or more. It could be 2 different variables. So let's say, let's just talk about we're selling ice cream and it's at the coast. And Y is really considered our outcome variable. It's called the result. And let's say that Y is going to be the number of ice cream sales. X is the different things that could actually factor into the number of ice cream sales. And if we want to determine if there's a correlation between certain type of variables, let's say it's, we look at it and we look at the months of the year, and there are certain months that ice cream sales are a lot higher than other months, we can kind of assume maybe heat has something to do with it. The hotter people are, the more ice cream sales. So heat is a variable. X would be that one of those variables. Y, the outcome variable, is number of sales, but are there other things that could affect, the ice cream sales? And so we've got an independent variable, that's the cause, and the dependent variable. So independent variable would be the heat. It could be rain. It could be a different type of the year. It could be, is it more men or women buying ice cream, younger, older, different age, whatever the case may be. We have all these different independent variables, and the dependent variable says that it is dependent on what those independent variables are. So the dependent variable, it is the effect or outcome variable. That is the number of ice cream sales. Kind of important to understand a little bit about that, even though we're not going to get too much into research. Then a hypothesis is making a prediction. Very kind of a tough thing. If you want to know more about it, I can get into it later. You don't need to know this too much, but what we're trying to do is our hypothesis means that we're trying to disprove what everyone else believes. So, and they call it a null hypothesis. We're actually disproving their belief. And it's kind of hard to understand because it's kind of a negative thing. You're thinking, why am I trying to disprove something? Well, you're disproving common belief, and that's what our hypothesis is. Our null hypothesis means if we disprove the null hypothesis, meaning what other people believe, and if we disprove that, that means that we're right and they're wrong. It's just kind of what that means. So it's an educated guess based on observations. Descriptive research is used when it's generally used when it's challenging or even impossible to control the variables in a question. Naturalistic observation, case studies, correlation studies, you can't control it. It's just very descriptive. You're writing about the experiences, the things that were noticed and seen, and you just do your best when you're writing a descriptive analysis or research report to be as detailed as you can as possible, but you can't control the environment. And experimental research, for doing an experiment, you want to control the environment as much as you can, so you can make sure that those independent variables are controlled, where there's not too many that are really affecting that outcome variable, which is the dependent variable. And then we get into statistical significance. We look at, and it's called a P factor, the probability factor. And we won't get into it too much, but most researchers set it at what's called 0.05, and it's a scientific, it's a number where you run your numbers and you see if things are exactly with the cause and effect relationship, that X and Y, if X is here, if X is higher, the temperature is higher, what percentage of the time are ice cream sales going to be higher? So if it's always, it would be a perfect one. If it's never, it would be a negative one, meaning it's an inverse relationship. So the temperature, every time it increases, ice cream sales go down. If that were the case, it would be called a negative relationship. So you're going to look from a negative one to a positive one. Zero means there's no effect. So the further it pushes out your results to either positive one or negative one, that's 100%. Either it's a positive correlation or a negative correlation. That means that your research is good, meaning, it's okay if it's negative. It just means, hey, it's adversely related. And that may be what you're probably trying to prove, that something has a negative effect or adverse relationship to the outcome variable. So we're analyzing the data, we're plotting our data. And if we can see that all the data is plotted on a line, that's when we do a statistical analysis and we can make a prediction when the temperature is a certain amount, then that means we're going to have this many ice cream sales. If it shows that's a perfect correlation, and we know that if it's 88 degrees versus 95 degrees, then it benefits the person that has an ice cream stand that they bring enough ice cream for that day, understanding what that temperature is going to be. That's why it's important. And then we get into the human brain or trying to predict the potential for success of an employee. It gets more complicated, but it's the same type of theory. The closer our numbers are to that line, that data, that statistical model, the better our statistical analysis is going to be, is kind of how that works. So we draw a conclusion, we report on our findings, and then of course we have it peer reviewed to have someone else look through it that's not going to benefit or not part of the study, that are just going to put a different set of eyes on it. And then in the step 7, we repeat it. That's what it's not on here, but the 7 that you don't see on that chart that I showed is repeat it, to do repeat measures to say we're double checking this. We're going to repeat it at least once or twice, and with another group of different people or different a time, a location. Let's say in ice cream sales, we're in a really hot area in the south, and then we go to the north, or we go to a different country and see if it actually is going to give us that same result. So that's the importance of replicating scientific results. You can read that. Self-report data. I already told you about the problem with self-report data. But there's also things in data that we're concerned about are biases. So it could be, let's say that we're looking at if someone would be successful in a certain job. If the recruiter is only hiring men, for instance, and not women, then we need to be able to know that the data that we're bringing in is biased data. And it's really hard to be able to tell. But when we run our numbers, you probably heard of the term outliers. So when we're looking and we have a bunch of recruiters and we're seeing everything is on the line, but there's a couple that are way off the line. That means it's an outlier that we can run it and say, okay, that may have just been some kind of anomaly or something that just kind of happened. But if there are too many of them, we need to take a look at it because it's affecting our data. There may be something else we're looking at. And it may be that we have this group, let's say, of numbers that are down here. When we look at it further, let's say if it's in a hiring situation, and we look at that all came from one recruiter that who they recruited were not successful. They're not on that line. If we take a close look, we may find out that person's hiring all men, for instance, and that is affecting the results, and they're not as successful as maybe someone that, that's when they are just hiring men or women or whatever the case may be. So that's what that statistical analysis does. Okay, there's a disadvantage. Of course, that disadvantage for naturalistic observation that may be biased. We don't know why. We can't conclusively identify it until you look to it. And just understand too, observer effect, that's the part where change in behavior caused by awareness of what's being observed. That's not being trained. That could have observer effect too, or that they may act different. If you look at something called the Hawthorne studies. It was done in the 1920s, I believe. It was a plant that the people are typewriting, and they said, we want to come in. They're wondering why production was down, and they're not typing, or it was sewing. Maybe it was a sewing factory. So these researchers came in, and when they came in, they said, listen, it's too bright in here. You need to lower the lights. It's just way too bright. So they lowered the lights, and production went up. And they're like, wow, we just solved it. It was a lighting problem. Researchers leave, all of a sudden production goes down again. So they bring them back in and say, what's going on? This, production's down. It's not working. And they go back in, they turn the lights up, production goes up again. And what they find out was it was just the attention. That's observer effect too, that they knew they were being observed and they were aware of being observed. And because of that, they perform better. So that's an observer effect. And also, realize that in most of these, when we do some studies like this, we call a blind study. A blind study means that the observers do not know that they're being watched. And if you hear of something called a double blind study, that actually means that not only the observers don't know they're being watched, but the people that are observing don't know. Let's say that we're giving half of the people this one new medication, the other half are just taking a tab of a salt pill. They don't realize which one is which. So a double blind study means even the people that are reporting on the results, because they could have biases that they think that drug works, to look at it a certain way. So they make it a double blind study. So they have no idea who took the medication and who didn't whenever they're reporting. So physiological data, mapping brain activity, a lot of stuff with fMRI that you may hear about one day, but where they measure where, you can tell where memories come from, hippocampus, and a lot of different places where the memories are stored, the different type of things going on in the brain, they map it. And believe it or not, even this fMR, tie that into a 3D printer, and you can actually, they're doing studies on this now, but you can print your thoughts. Really crazy. And I saw even this morning, they showed the person with Elon Musk that person was paralyzed, quadriplegic, and played chess with their mind. So that's all part of some of that brain map activity, and using it to be able to illustrate or make movement through the thought mind process. Very scary, but very cool in some ways. Okay, so here just reliability and validity. Just know that reliability means that the research is reliable, meaning if someone does exactly what we tell them to do, that test is, they're going to have similar results. Where validity means that your research experiment is measuring exactly what it's intending to measure. So that's really important. Statistical methods, reliability and validity really come in, and that you'll see in the report, statistical analysis, on how these reports work by, how reliable and how valid is that scale or questionnaire. So you can look at some of these. The question, one advantage of the experimental method is it allows us to show a clear cause and effect relationship to be identified. That's what that experimental method, where we're controlling the environment, that X and Y. You remember the dependent variable and independent variable. So the independent is the X and the outcome variable is the Y. That's the dependent variable is Y, independent variable X. And that just tells you that there is a relationship, whether it's +1, -1, how strong is that correlation or that relationship. So independent variables, dependent, extraneous variables, that's something that we don't know about that could be really affecting our experiment. And you kind of see that when you do a statistical analysis and some of these, factors. So what we do is when we do a research experiment, we may measure 10 different things, and to see what possible correlations, like if it's an application and someone's applying for a job, does it really matter different things? Why do they have to ask for gender at birth? Why do they have to ask for age? Does it really matter? In a lot of jobs, it has no bearing. Don't even think it should be asked. It doesn't make sense. It shouldn't be a question, especially on an entrance exam, unless they can prove why that is important. But so they'll measure everything, and then what you do is you eliminate the factors that aren't really important. And when you do an assessment, you're only going to ask questions. The fewer variables that you have of these independent variables that you have, the better your test is going to be. So you want to eliminate any one, because the more you have, the less power that your experiment, your data is going to show. So an important thing to know here too is that the only difference between experimental and a control group is the only possible cause of a change in the dependent variable is an independent variable. Read it a couple of times, make sure you understand it. Could have a test question on that. So random assignment, we're not going to get into this. Just read it. Make sure you read it a little bit, but just making sure that you're randomly selecting a population sample. And it's not just you're asking only male people to take it, only college students to take your questionnaire, that it needs to have a random environment that affects everyone. We don't want to have it, we want to be inclusive of all different population groups as possible. So we want to make sure it's very a random, that our experiment, our subjects are random and they're not too similar. Are told about that. Statistically significant, told about the p factor 0.05 is general setting, meaning 95% of the time. A 0.05 p factor means a probability is going to be less than, if it's less than 0.05, meaning 5%, means that 95% of the time that you do what we tell you to do on this test, you're going to have a similar result. That is the highest measurement we look for. It's not the highest, 0.99 is, but never a perfect 100 that I've seen, but usually that's what we look for is 0.95. Certain, meaning 95% of the time, and it's a probability of failure is 0.05. Anything less than 0.05 is a great experiment. That's a statistically significant result. Research participant bias, changing their behavior because they know they're being evaluated. Talk about that. The placebo, that's a SALT tab that I'm telling you about. If they think, and there's some new studies, you ever heard of Andrew Huberman Labs? It's a podcast. I highly recommend listening to it. You're going to learn so much, but they're finding out now that this placebo effect, when people are taking placebo, that these chemical reactions in their body actually, they can increase certain chemicals and neurons that the adrenaline, just because they think it's there. It's crazy, but there's a placebo effect that if they think they're taking a real drug, but yet they took a placebo, that placebo effect means that they still are going to have that same result. And that's what that is. So, and then I already talked about single blind study, double blind study, researcher bias, self-fulfilling prophecy, already talked about that. So correlational research, descriptive study that quantifies the degree which events measure or variables are associated. This is the data. So general designs, let me talk about that. Here's the important thing with a correlational study. I mentioned earlier about the 0.1 or -1. So if you're looking here at the screen, 0, if there's a 0 is your correlation coefficient, meaning that these two things aren't related at all, that the weather had no effect on ice cream sales, but we know it does. And if it's, let's say that there's a 95% chance, so they would be, over here it would be 0.95, the correlation coefficient, and this would be negative 0.095 or 0.95. This is negatively inverse related. So the higher the temperature, the lower your ice cream sales would be. This means the higher the temperature, the more ice cream is a positive correlation. 1 is 100%, -1 is -100, meaning a perfect negative correlation. So that's what the correlation study is, to see the two or more variables, how are they related? And the coefficient means how they're expressed in their strong and how strongly they're correlated. The closer they are to 0, the less correlation. The further they are to 0.1 or -1, the more correlated they are. This is kind of a line that I talked about, a strength of relationship. 0 meaning if you put all the data points on a plot, they're scattered all over the place. Perfect correlation means they're all sitting on the data line. And negative correlation means, remember, the higher the temperature, the lower the sales, and that's where this is a perfect negative, this is a perfect positive. That's what kind of this is, a strength in relationship. So there's correlation and causation. Correlation does not demonstrate causation. Doesn't mean that caused it. That just means they're correlated. We need to find out what the cause is. So just because it's online doesn't mean that's the reason. We want to find, we need to test the cause and effect, and that's by controlling the environment if we can, or making sure we're really paying attention to extraneous variables or other variables that can be affecting our dependent variable, our result. A case study, you probably heard of case studies. These are just ways to get people to think about how cause and effect relationships. Not going to go over to it. I want to try to get this finished. And we're going to get into some we're going to get into some test questions now to kind of finish this up. This is something to kind of pay attention to. Those of you that are listening, that watch this video, I'm telling you also, just to let you know, I do need to find out if there's a certain time we can have a live meeting that we can all meet. I know that you've got things going on, so I may send out a survey to see if there's a certain time that's better than others for you to have a live meeting. During those live meetings, if you do attend, so far I'm not planning on recording them, but I tend to have go over some of the test questions. So, if you're there, we had one person this past week that actually saw, and it was the first week. You probably didn't know about it, but you do get a couple of test questions that if you do attend the live thing. And there are some bonus questions that are in there too. So you should have every opportunity to score very high on this quiz. So here's a knowledge check. The tendency to believe claims, and the only ones I put in here, don't get fearful. I put some of these questions in here because we didn't talk about this just now, but they may be in your book, they may be in the video. So watch the videos, but make sure you read chapter 1 because most of these are in chapter 1, and that's the only way you're going to get these answers. So I put a couple of harder ones in here. The tendency to believe claims because they seem to be true or because it would be nice if they were true. And I did talk about that a little bit, but it's called uncritical acceptance. You're not critically thinking. Think of it that way. You're accepting it, but it's not critical. It's just because you believe it to be true or you want it to be true. So it's called uncritical acceptance. Personal observation of one's thoughts, feelings, or behavior is called what? Think about that. Personal observation of one's thoughts, feelings, or behavior. It's called introspection. The study of sensations and personal experience analyzed as basic elements. What is that called? The study of sensations. It's a study. So we know it's not scientific observation. Is it Gestalt? Is it functionalism or structural? Structuralism. What is that? Structuralism. Which of the following is unfounded belief held without evidence? It's without evidence in spite of falsifying evidence. So falsifying evidence means that, so it's not going to be your uncritical acceptance is there isn't falsifying evidence. It's just we believe it to be true and we think it's true, but there's not the evidence to show you prove that that part is not true, like a horoscope. But when we're looking at this, what is that? And it's really just superstition. There's falsifying evidence saying that superstition is not accurate, but yet people still believe it. Like a baseball player that won't step a pitcher on the line. I was a pitcher and I never wanted to because a superstition, because when you believe it to be true, it can happen where you have a bad game if you step on that line. So you just avoid it. But it's a superstition. In Freudian theory, the parts of the mind that are beyond awareness, do you remember that? We talk about beyond awareness, especially conflicts, impulses, and desires not directly known to a person. So there is unconscious, but this is really dynamic unconscious. So the beyond awareness, you can't get to it. So the unconscious, you can kind of get to it. You can get to the unconscious, and that's where that psychoanalytic theory is that they try to do, from hypnosis to dream interpretation is what Freud tried to do, is interpret dreams, these things that he believed were a way we're interpreting the world or experiences, that negative events that we push so far down that we don't want to remember them or think they're true, but they're there. And if they have this psychoanalysis, they can take that unconscious and bring it to conscious awareness, and that's how they deal with it. They try to deal with it by understanding it from a different lens, and that's a big part of psychology. But this is dynamic unconscious that you can't get to it. It's so far down. Which of the following is an example of a positive correlation? So look at that. What do you think? The average income and shoe size. Do you think the bigger shoes, the more income or less income? Average income and heart disease? Possibly. The harder you have to work for that income. Is it heart disease? Do you think that's it? School grades and the amount of time spent playing video games. I kind of think that one in some ways, but that could be a good answer. But height and weight. The taller you are, the more you're going to weigh. So you may think not, but that's a positive correlation. The taller you are, the more you're likely to weigh is kind of true. That's kind of it. So anyway, thank you for paying attention. I hope this helped. It is something that if it helps and you are not able to attend the classes, and I understand that this is an asynchronous course, I will continue to make, but please let me know if you have any questions about the exam due on Sunday at 9. Please don't wait till the last minute. I've also, because it is the first test, I've extended the time. Usually you have an hour. I think I extended to an hour and a half, I believe, give you more time. Didn't lock down your browser. A lot of times these quizzes, your browser will be locked. I didn't do that. I want you to have every opportunity. This was a short week. There's a lot to cover. I also want you to do very well in this class. There are 7 quizzes that you're going to take, and realize that only your top 5 scores are going to count. I want you to study. I want you to prepare. This is open book. Make sure you're using OneNote. A lot of the answers are going to be in OneNote, and it's very easy. Practice searching on OneNote, because that's going to help you get to the answers quickly. So I think that you're going to, do well. But if you don't do as well, and I think to do it in the morning. Try not to do it last minute. Do it when you're conscious, when you're awake. The best time that you're usually on your best is usually, for most people, it's a few hours after you wake up. And I recommend that you just, as long as you're prepared and you have your notes ready, you will do well. Everyone is going to get, you're going to get different questions on the test. So it's not, and they're all mixed up and stuff like that, but they're all very, very similar in difficulty. But I wish you well. I hope you do well. If you have any questions, make sure that you message me at the bottom of my emails. Also, you can set an appointment with me. You'll see my schedule on there, and I would be more than happy to help. But again, WhatsApp is the best way to get a hold of me. And please reach out to me. Do not be fearful that you're bothering me. You're not. It's something that I love to do, and I want to make sure that you do well in this course, and also you know how to apply this information you learned to your own life. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.